Hagen and Amy M. Hay, who are going to talk about their recent books in the NEXUS series as a launching point to explore the ways in which environmental history and closely allied fields intersect and inform one another. So I'll introduce our authors and our commentator, Fritz Davis, in a moment. Let's do some preliminaries, though. We are recording this session, so I want you to know that. I want to thank the American Society for Environmental History for hosting these special Earth Week events. I also want to thank Claire Lewis Evans, who is Senior Acquisitions Editor for the press and in this field, and is shepherding these fine books and has organized this event. And Claire will be available via the chat, and during the Q&A, we'll do a little more introduction there and can answer questions about the NEXUS series and the UA Press. Also, you can find a link to a book sale with 50% off on the NEXUS books and other environmental history titles, and that'll appear in the chat box as well. And of course, I want to acknowledge the NEXUS series editors, Mark Hersey, who is here, and Alex Huey, who is also on the Zoom with us, as well as Alan Marcus, all of the Mississippi State University's Department of History. This series has an advisory board of distinguished scholars, and I want to mention them as well. Amy Sue Bix, Fritz Davis, who's here, Jim Downs, Richard A. Richards here at UA, Suman Seth, Betty Smokovitz, and Jessica Wang. These books each reflect major themes in the series subtitle, which is New Histories of Science, Technology, the Environment, Agriculture, and Medicine. As series co-editor Alan Marcus has written, these books address questions of the past that place science explicitly at the core. These three books, I think, really show the unity as well as the breadth of the series. On the one hand, they engage shared themes of science and politics, the unpredicted and potentially hazardous impacts of technological innovations, of human alterations of nature, and of anthropogenic change. At the same time, these books really show the breadth of the series, ranging from global agricultural policy to the intellectual history of ecology and evolution, to wartime hazards at home, and gender-based movements for social change. The authors that we'll be hearing from today, Doug Hurt is professor of history at Purdue University. Doug is former editor of the journal Agricultural History and former president of the Agricultural History Society. His work places the economic and political aspects of agricultural history in an environmental and social context. Among his books are American Agriculture, A Brief History, Problems of Plenty, The American Farmer in the 20th Century, and Food and Agriculture During the Civil War. This newest book, The Green Revolution in the Global South, which you see the cover here, Science, Politics, and Unintended Consequences, came out in 2020 and provides a nuanced account of the successes and the unintended consequences of the Green Revolution as the movement's technological innovations interacted with political and economic and cultural systems around the world, Latin America, Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. Joel Hagen, who will go next, is Professor Emeritus of Biology at Radford University. His research interests are in intellectual and institutional histories of 20th century biology, primarily developments in ecology and related fields. He is the author also of An Entangled Bank, The Origin of Ecosystem Ecology, and co-authored Doing Biology, which is a collection of historical case studies directed towards students in introductory biology courses. The new book published this month is Life Out of Balance, Homeostasis and Adaptation in a Darwinian World, which traces historical developments in physiology, ecology, behavior and evolutionary biology during the decades following World War II, when new ideas about biological self-regulation and adaptation and fitness led to larger debates about the merits of such models as applied to larger systems, including society at large. Amy Hay is Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, where she teaches 20th century American history. Her areas of research also include American women's and gender history and medical and environmental history. She's held prestigious fellowships at the Chemical Heritage Foundation and as a Carson Fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich. Her book, The Defoliation of America, Agent Orange Chemicals, Citizens and Protest, which will be coming out this coming November, examines the use of phenoxyherbicides in and by the United States during the mid-20th century and shows how pushback from different groups of citizens challenged and ultimately changed the way hazardous chemicals are regulated in the US. Commenting on all of these books is Frederick Rowe Davis, who will talk a bit more about the aims of the series and talk about the books. Fritz is department head, professor of history, and Mark Lover's chair in the history of science at Purdue. His research interests lie at the intersection of environmental science, environmental health, and environmental history. Fritz's recently published book is Banned, A History of Pesticides and the Science of Technology with Yale. And I'm curious about this new project working on Making Silent Spring, which is a study of Rachel Carson, how she wrote her best-selling expose of ecological and health risks and chemical pesticides. So I've done those introductions up front so the authors can just each go in turn. Each of our authors will speak about the books for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then Fritz will talk about the series and the books. We'll give the authors a chance to engage with Fritz's comments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat as we move along, which would be great. This is a Zoom, not a webinar. So you may want to put your screen on speaker view when the authors are speaking. Be sure to remain muted during the author presentations. So with that said, first up, we have Doug Hurt, The Green Revolution in the Global South.
Thank you, Ellen. My book is really an introduction to the Green Revolution, and I cast it for anyone who comes to the subject for the first time. It's really written for the non-specialist, and I'm particularly concerned about the origins and development and consequences of the Green Revolution. So it's really intended for anyone who will only read one book or perhaps a scattering of articles about the Green Revolution. It's a complex subject, the literature is voluminous, and my intent has been to synthesize and boil things down so you could have a workable study that made sense and it didn't take a long time to get through. But basically, I'm assessing the achievements and failures of the Green Revolution. So it's really a synthesis of agricultural and environmental and political reasons on the part of those who supported it and those who rejected it. And I contend that the Green Revolution was neither an unmitigated success nor an abject failure. And that science and politics determined the success and failure of the Green Revolution. It wasn't just a matter of agricultural science, but rather the Green Revolution is market and state driven. And this is as equally important, if not more so, than the agricultural science behind it. And I argue that politics perpetuated the social and the economic inequalities that were derived from the Green Revolution, and clearly there were many. I also argue that the Green Revolution did not end poverty and hunger in food deficit nations. The one thing it did do, however, is foster a very contentious debate about the value of agricultural research without social controls. So my intent was to trace the debate between the hard scientists, the agricultural scientists, who were really the staunch supporters of the Green Revolution, and the social science critics who were diametrically opposed to many of the things that resulted from it. And my period is from the late 1940s, early 1940s to the present. I have a chapter on Mexico and Central America, a chapter on India and Pakistan, a chapter on India, one on Southeast Asia, another on Sub-Saharan Africa, and another on the Green Revolution. Then I wrap up with a chapter of reflections bringing it all together. I consider the nations that I dealt with on a chapter basis the most representative of the regions, geographical areas, or even nation states that were involved with the Green Revolution. And it's among these entities that you can really see the success and failures of the Green Revolution, I think, quite clearly. I would certainly say that the Green Revolution has been controversial from the very beginning. And the critics have been very adamant over the years to charge that it really only benefited elite farmers, those that could afford the package of hybrid seeds and fertilizer and irrigation, which were the premises for the Green Revolution, and that poor farmers certainly couldn't afford that. And to an extent, that's true, but certainly there's a considerable amount of qualification that needs to be applied to that generalization. Critics have also charged that the Green Revolution created greater inequality, that it increased land values, that it decreased wage labor and displaced agricultural workers, fostered the consolidation of land holdings, and drove poor farmers from the land. And while all of that is true, these are not absolute statements. They're colored with nuance, and in many respects, we have shades of gray rather than absolutes here. Certainly, hunger remained in food deficit nations, and the Green Revolution did benefit commercial farming. There's no question about that. The agricultural scientists, however, reject all of these contentions and generally say that their job is really to increase food production. And it's the social consequences of what they did are really not their responsibility, but rather the responsibilities of governments. Basically, my conclusions are that the Green Revolution was not scale neutral, as the agricultural scientists contended, and that subsistence farmers really couldn't afford the high-yielding varieties of seeds and fertilizer and irrigation, or even the genetically modified varieties that came later. And certainly not all people were affected equally by the Green Revolution. And in this context, I also contend that Norman Borlaug was wrong in that his research emanating from the Mexican agricultural program really couldn't be transferred latitudinally. Borlaug believed that the high-yielding seed varieties that he and his colleagues developed, particularly wheat and maize, could be planted anywhere, even without irrigation, even without fertilizer. He believed that genetics controlled everything. And in this, he really discounted photoperiod insensitivity. Sunlight makes a difference, latitude makes a difference. So you find that his high-yielding varieties really transferred in areas latitudinally that corresponded with Mexico. And this is one of the reasons, among many, for the failure of the Green Revolution, I argue, in sub-Saharan Africa. Certainly, the Green Revolution contributed to environmental degradation. China is a good example of that, with water pollution, salinization of lands, depletion of the water table, and that would be true of India as well. And certainly the Green Revolution didn't apply equally across very broad areas in the context that in India, it was really basically successful in Punjab and less or so or not at all in other portions of India. So basically, I argue that the Green Revolution requires state support. If it's going to be successful, it requires governments to support grain prices, to subsidize fertilizer and provide access to markets, that is, an infrastructure. Certainly, politics and the environment trumped agricultural science. The Green Revolution was market-oriented. It was not oriented to subsistence farmers and food deficit people. And this matter of being state-driven, I think, is essential. Certainly, the Green Revolution provides evidence that agricultural science creates political, economic, and social power. And it proved that, it proved that it was productive. There's no question about that. But it also proved that it is and was neutral concerning economic and social ramifications that emanated from it. But that being said, does not mean that the Green Revolution was detrimental, as many of the critics contend. And I'd be happy later to address any questions.
That's great, Doug. Thank you so much for that. And now we're moving along. Joel, Life Out of Balance.
In writing Life Out of Balance, I had a number of objectives. I wanted to explore the appeal of ideas about balance and self-regulation, not only among physiologists, but also among ecologists and specialists in other biological disciplines. I also wanted to examine the persistent criticisms raised against the idea of balance of nature. And finally, I wanted to discuss the sometimes fruitful, but often problematic interactions among medicine, evolutionary theory, and environmental sciences, particularly as related to balance and self-regulation. Throughout history, balance of nature has been an important component of environmental thought. Today, I briefly want to examine two closely related versions of this concept that developed during the early and mid-20th century. Homeostasis is the ability of organisms to self-regulate the internal environment of the body in the face of the fluctuating external environment surrounding it. Temperature regulation in birds and mammals is the example that everybody is familiar with and has served as kind of a paradigmatic example for the development of homeostasis. The idea of homeostasis was developed and popularized by the Harvard physiologist Walter B. Cannon during the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it was quickly picked up by ecologists and applied to superorganismal units such as populations, communities, ecosystems, and sometimes the entire biosphere. Closely related to homeostasis are the ideas associated with cybernetics, particularly the idea of negative feedback. In a cybernetic system, low energy signals are used to regulate high energy processes. For example, the thermostat controls both the furnace and air conditioner to regulate the temperature of a building. Hormones and nerves regulate the metabolism of an organism. It's important to note that Norbert Wiener, who was central to the development of cybernetics after World War II, was strongly influenced by Walter Cannon and his idea of homeostasis. Wiener and others emphasized the similarities in self-regulation among organisms, automated machines, and societies. Cybernetic and homeostatic ideas have proved enticing to environmentalists for several reasons. If populations, communities, and ecosystems are truly self-regulating, this partly explains why human activities so often have negative effects on nature. It also provides a justification for preservation of natural areas free from human interference. At the same time, the ties to medicine and physiology suggest ways that informed human intervention might heal and perhaps even enhance natural systems. Such intervention requires understanding the fundamental laws that govern self-regulation in all organized systems. Finally, the cybernetic approach, which claims that all systems are regulated by the same fundamental laws, suggests a holistic approach to environmental problems. Indeed, citing the universal nature of self-regulating mechanisms, some supporters have claimed that homeostasis should be considered the second law of biology, comparable in importance to natural selection. The appeal of this type of thinking is illustrated by the recent book, The Serengeti Rules, written by Sean Carroll. Carroll is a prominent molecular biologist and is well known for his popular writings about biology. In the Serengeti Rules, Carroll argues that all biological systems are governed by the same basic cybernetic processes. Through an engaging series of chapters on topics as diverse as nutrition, cancer biology, population growth, and species interactions in ecosystems, Carroll illustrates how feedback control regulates biological processes and how the breakdown of these control systems leads to disease and environmental degradation. Carroll argues for the importance of preserving ecosystems in their natural states, but also for using human understanding of feedback control to solve environmental problems. For Carroll, scientific medicine is a powerful model for an activist approach to environmentalism. Critics, on the other hand, have dismissed such claims as misleading and perhaps dangerous. For example, in his book, The Balance of Nature, biologist John Critcher argues that nature is not in balance and never has been. According to Critcher, the idea of balance of nature has been an enduring myth in ecology and perhaps biology more broadly. He includes ecosystem homeostasis within this broad critique. Despite its popularity, homeostasis, particularly as used in ecology, has faced continued scrutiny for the past half-century. Critics deny that populations, communities, and ecosystems are truly cybernetic systems, rather than simply collections of organisms that interact in non-cybernetic ways. More fundamentally, critics deny that homeostasis could evolve in populations, communities, or ecosystems. According to these critics, natural selection operates only at the level of genes or individual organisms. As such, it is inherently selfish and cannot promote the good of groups except under very restricted conditions. This precludes the evolution of self-regulation in ecosystems and other high-level biological units. Although controversies over homeostasis and self-regulation arose during the middle of the 20th century, both support and criticism of these ideas continue to inform discussions of a wide range of biological phenomena, from molecular biology to ecosystem ecology. Homeostasis continues to be a fruitful concept with broad interdisciplinary appeal, but also a target of criticism and disagreement about the role of balance in nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel. And now we're moving along to Amy Hay, whose book coming out in November is The Defoliation of America, Agent Orange, Chemicals, Citizens, and Protests. And we need to unmute you.
I was
It has to happen at least once.
Yeah, so was me. I was really pleased when I was preparing for tonight to realize how many of the areas in the NEXUS series focus topics that the book checks off, right? And so that'll be possibly a part of what I refer to. But one of the things that motivated me to write this book is my previous work had looked at Love Canal and the chemical disaster that took place in the summer of 1978. And I'm a post-war historian, and I was really interested in the anti-toxics movement, right? And so once you start to look at protest against toxic contamination, you realize that it's prevalent across the United States. And the question can arise, why does it never cohere into more of a more visible national movement? And one of the things that I realized in writing the book, that it is often these campaigns are often local and dispersed. They're often led by women and unfortunately easily dismissed. And with the death of Rachel Carson in 1964, they lost a very visible leader that I think really hurt any opportunity or moment that they may have cohered into a much more visible and cohesive organization. And as Ellen mentioned, the book very much is interested in groups of citizens who are going to initially challenge narratives of safety about the Agent Orange chemicals, eventually protest, and then have some mixed results as far as affecting change. So one of the ways that it fits the Nexus series is it is about science. I mean, it's about two chemical compounds, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, which are phenoxy herbicides. They become prominent and commercially viable because they're selective growth inhibitors, right? So they do this great thing where they kill weeds, but they don't kill foodstuffs for the most part. And so that makes them very attractive in the post-war environment. So at least in the United States, initially they're going to be used to clear lots. They're going to be used widely in agriculture because they're perceived as labor saving and cost efficient. And then they're going to be used in the timber industry and by public services to clear roadways and promote more valuable timber stock. So one of the things I like, though, about the project is I get to capture scientists doing more than just science in one sense, because they are, the developers of these chemicals. They're going to be intimately involved in the commercial application of these chemicals, but their expertise is actually going to lead them eventually to challenge the use of the chemicals themselves, right? So they are motivated by their professional expertise and the new awareness of the ways that these chemicals are going to cause problems. And so that's one of the things that I'm pleased about with respect to the work. And then the second group of individuals that are going to be major participants in these protests are women, right? Like grassroots activists who often don't identify as environmental or health activists, but are motivated by the toxic effects they perceived their families experiencing after exposure to the herbicide sprayings. And so I used 3 Western women as case studies. And one of the things that I think the book does a nice job of is it doesn't just talk about the protests, but it also talks about why were they using the chemicals in the first place, right? So in Arizona, the chemicals were being used to increase water supplies for Phoenix. In California, they were being used for brush control. In Los Angeles, agricultural purposes in the Central California, and then in Northern California for brush control in national forest. And then in Oregon, it was the timber industry who was concerned about brush control for roadways access, but also to promote more valuable timber stock. And these women actually form a loose network, but they are all going to be involved in arousing their communities about concerns about these the spraying of these herbicides locally, and are going to be challenging both scientific authority, but also public officials who they often felt ignored, and if at best dismissed their efforts to raise this concern. And then the final group of citizens is going to be United States veterans, right? So the people who are in South Vietnam, sprayed by the chemicals, are going to return home and start to experience ill health. And the bureaucracy is not sympathetic to these claims. And so they were going to form and start to protest and say, look, we served our country, we have a right to have care provided to us. And one of the things that becomes especially poignant and stark is the fact that it's not just the veterans themselves that are suffering ill effects, but also their children, right? So there's a whole nother generation that has been exposed and is like there's a raft of birth defects and particularly spina bifida. So one of the things I think is important is for the most part, these activists have been overlooked, understudied at best, and they're very much critiquing the military industrial complex, right, that Eisenhower warned about. They are challenging these narratives of safety, right, like the US government and the US military, when they were using it in Vietnam, where like there were these proclamations of safety, right? It was only going to kill plants. It would leave animals and people safe. And the only problem with that is the same year that they're going to be broadly used in Vietnam in 1962 is the same year that Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring, which is a direct counter narrative to that, right? I mean, her whole point is that the ecosystem is interdependent, and just killing something that just kills plants actually will affect wildlife, will affect human beings. And then as more research is done, there's a realization that there is problems with the chemicals themselves. We now know that they're endocrine disruptors, right? So there's like the more research that has been done, the more it has validated the concerns of the activists on the ground. So they protest, they have mixed results. The veterans may be the most successful. There's some changes in chemical regulation and policy. I mean, the 2,4-T or 2,4,5-T is actually eventually banned. So there's ways that these activists are able to affect change. And I think it's important that their voices are recovered, not just as protesters, but the ideas that they were fighting for the right of citizens to have a say in policy, and also to be partners at the table when discussions are being made about how chemicals will be used and who potentially is going to be affected. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, Amy, thank you so much. And Fritz, maybe I'll take a moment here before you tell us more about the series to introduce some of the folks from the press who are actually here on the call. Linda Manning is the director of the University of Alabama Press, is here. And I saw a moment ago, we had Wendy Schaffer. I'm not sure if she's here right now. And we have another author in the series whose book came out in 2018, and that's David Bale, and his book is Chemical Hands. And we also have someone who's probably in on the ground floor of this series, and that's Elizabeth Motherwell, I see is signed on. So, and David Spatz, well, we know this is a busy week for you, so we're delighted that you could take the time to join this conversation. And now we're going to move to Fritz Davis, who will tell a little more about the aims of the series and offer us some comments, some reflections on these books.
Well, let me just say thank you to our speakers. Are you getting that echo?
You sound fine to me.
All right. Maybe it's just on my end, which is fine. So thank you to the speakers, Doug Hurt, Joel Hagen, Amy Hay, and also to Ellen Griffith Spears and Claire Strom. So I'm actually really happy to be part of the editorial board for the NEXUS series. The full title is New Histories of Science, Technology, the Environment, Agriculture, and Medicine. I think the series fits a unique space in our collective fields in that it's really dedicated to synthetic works and works at the intersections with other types of knowledge, music, urban planning, educational policy. And it's particularly interested and concerned with the interface of nature and culture, and it embraces these emerging intellectual constellations of synthesis, new methods, new approaches to the study of people and nature through time. So I should also note that in addition to the director of University of Alabama Press and the series editor, Claire Strom, there are also two of this, or the book editor, the press. There's also two of the series editors here, Alex Huey and Mark Hersey. So I think that encompasses the entire list of people who are here who are more qualified than I am to speak about the books and their authors. But if I've left anyone off that list, just add it into the chat, or we can bring it up during discussion. But let me just take a few minutes to offer some reflections on the books at hand. Early in his recent book, The Green Revolution in the Global South, R. Douglas Hurt notes that, quote, someone else could write this history under the same title with an entirely different approach on the subject matter. Another scholar could write it a third time, and others probably more, without repeating anything. On the one hand, Hurt's comment echoes William Cronin's reflection on the meanings of stories, but on the other, he suggests that the history or histories of the Green Revolution requires interpretation, and many interpretations at that. A pattern emerges over the course of Hurt's thoughtful analysis. Introduction of the novel varieties, which is to say the high yield varieties of crops, particularly wheat and corn. So introduction of the novel varieties and chemical fertilizers, qualified successes with regard to productivity, uneven distribution with disparities between large-scale farmers and small-scale farmers, and of course, unintended consequences, including environmental damage. Nevertheless, in most cases, Hurt notes a marked improvement in food security within the particular nation of study. And as I was reading this account of the Green Revolution, as it played out across Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, China, and Africa, I couldn't help wondering about James Scott's Seeing Like a State. In country after country, the introduction of technology in the form of high yield varieties and chemical fertilizers, as well as machinery and pesticides, sounded like examples of Scott's high modernist schemes. So I'd be really interested in Professor Hurt's take on Seeing Like a State. Hurt takes an even-handed approach, concluding, quote, the Green Revolution was neither an unmitigated success nor an abject failure. It increased grain, that is food production, but the Green Revolution did not prove as damaging to economic and social structures as critics charged. The agricultural science of the Green Revolution proved productive, but unneutral concerning economic and social ramifications. But that is not to say it was detrimental. Environmental and agricultural historians will appreciate the wide-ranging synthesis of the history of the Green Revolution in the Global South. Joel Hagen's Life Out of Balance, Homeostasis and Adaptation in a Darwinian World also provides a synthesis. Hagen examines the concept of homeostasis, or the ability of living things to maintain integrity and a degree of constancy in a fluctuating environment. Some have argued that homeostasis constitutes a second law of life after natural selection. Hagen argues, along with numerous physiologists and ecologists, that homeostasis must be an important part of adaptation in its physiological and evolutionary sense. In the introduction, Hagen cites the distinction drawn by Ernst Mayr between proximate causation used by functional biologists to answer, quote, how questions, and ultimate causation used by evolutionary biologists like Mayr to answer why questions. Mayr returned to this distinction numerous times over the course of his long career, and he argued that pointless controversies arose when biologists failed to recognize the distinction and confuse the two forms of causation. Of course, as Hagen notes, and others have noted, Mayr was a leading evolutionary biologist, and some have argued that the distinction subtly privileged his own viewpoint. Hagen argues that Life Out of Balance seriously examines the work of other prominent biologists who proposed philosophical perspectives that were less antagonistic to the physical sciences and avoided Mayr's strict dichotomies in defense of organismal biology. Hagen writes, although less familiar to historians and philosophers of biology, these alternative philosophical perspectives also had a profound effect on the development of modern studies of organisms, populations, communities, and ecosystems. As Hagen mentioned in his comments, Life Out of Balance also provides a corrective of sorts to a recent book, The Serengeti Rules by Sean Carroll. Carroll proclaims that all biological systems are regulated according to a common set of principles, and understanding self-regulation is the key to both human health and protecting the environment. Hagen notes, although I think he softened his claims in his comments, but the way I read him, he noted that bold claim ignores, for the most part, the controversies surrounding biological regulation. Such controversies have emerged even in medical physiology, where the idea was first introduced, and homeostasis, Hagen notes, has been even more controversial in other fields, including evolutionary biology and ecology, with critics denying the concept of self-regulation when applied to populations, communities, and ecosystems. Suffice it to say, much like his earlier work on ecosystem ecology, Life Out of Balance offers a wide-ranging and important history of a critical concept in the life sciences that reveals points of agreement and conflict across physiology, evolutionary biology, and ecology. In the Defoliation of America, Amy Hay writes about Agent Orange chemicals and the citizens who organized protests against the deployment of these chemicals. I think most of us are familiar with the story of how US forces deployed Agent Orange to defoliate the forests of Vietnam during the war, and Hay recounts the development and deployment of these chemicals quite effectively. She reflects that the herbicides both represented and facilitated the American air war in Vietnam, and they became a symbol of US technological superiority. Advisors demanded clearly demarcated boundaries, clearly identified enemy routes, and cleared landscapes to prevent attacks. In addition, Agent Orange chemicals served an important role in the psychological war and in crop destruction, which would deny food to enemy combatants. But what makes the Defoliation of America unique is the analysis of the use of Agent Orange chemicals in the United States, most notably by the US Forest Service. And I think what really sets the Defoliation of America apart is this balance between the ways in which the Agent Orange chemicals were deployed in Vietnam and the unintended and intended consequences, and the extensive use of Agent Orange chemicals in the United States. Hay focuses on 3 female environmental activists who fought passionately against Agent Orange utilization. She notes, Billy Shoecraft mobilized the community of Globe, Arizona, and demanded that aerial spraying of herbicides stop. Shoecraft then filed suit against the Forest Service and Dow Chemical. She went on to write a book about the protest, but she died before the lawsuit was settled. Ida Oneroff was a consumer advocate who broadcast a weekly radio program and published a newsletter to inform Californians, predominantly, about environmental issues. Oneroff called into question the close ties between state officials, university scientists, and chemical corporation representatives. Finally, Carol Van Strum's motivation to study herbicides was the accidental spraying and illness of her children. Van Strum formed an activist group to challenge the Forest Service's herbicide spraying program. Van Strum's group filed suit, which resulted in a qualified victory, and ultimately the EPA suspended almost all uses of 2,4,5-T based on concerns over the role of dioxin in miscarriages. Hay reflects on the successes of the fight against Agent Orange in the US and Vietnam. She notes that the ban on 2,4,5-T was an achievement, but continued widespread use of 2,4-D mitigated against that success. She writes, quote, citizen certainty in the face of scientific uncertainty found new support with the emergence of epigenetics. This realization that changes in phenotype could happen because of how genetic information is expressed or embodied versus what genetic information is coded as, rectified an age-old gender bias in scientific understanding of the reproductive harm of toxic exposures. Damage done to male sperm could be transmitted to the next generation. Damage to the Vietnamese forest by US spraying campaigns is still visible on the landscapes. However, Hay writes that dioxin contamination, though less visible, is potentially far more pernicious. The Defoliation of America offers a synthesis of the story of herbicides in the US and Vietnam, as well as a specific focus on the various individuals and groups that challenge the US government chemical company claims that the chemicals were safe. So again, I want to say thank you to all of our speakers and just note what a pleasure it's been what a pleasure it's been to be a part of the roundtable. Somehow I missed in my early comments one of the lines, so I'm just going to drop back to them. Okay, yeah, we're still good. This is now part of the conclusion, not the introduction. The three books in discussion today represent the themes of the series at large, which I mentioned very early on. So does another recent title, I'm reading this. So does another recent title in the series, David Bale's Chemical Lands, Pesticides, Aerial Spraying and Health in North America's Grasslands since 1945, which is about aerial spraying and the use of chemical insecticides in the Great Plains. And that's where I'll conclude. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Fritz. And David, I hope in the Q&A you'll weigh in too, because this really, you can see the unity in the series from all of these. So I thought what we do next is to give the authors a moment to engage with Fritz's comments, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Joel, I think you were first to unmute here.
Well, thanks, Fritz. I didn't mean to pull my punches with Sean Carroll during during my presentation. I do think we need to keep in mind that that's a popular book. He's writing mostly for students, and to go into all of the problems and controversies surrounding self-regulation probably wouldn't have served its purposes very well, but it opened a space for me to write such a book. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Fritz, I would just say thank you for being more eloquent than I was. So it's always nice that someone can improve and make something better. So I appreciate that.
Well, it's not really fair. I'm actually able to read directly from your book, and nobody wants to read directly from their own book.
I would just say in response to Fritz's comment about high modernism that I suspect Borlaug considered himself or would consider himself a high modernist, given the importance of the state. At the same time, he was always very unhappy with states because he never believed that governments provided the adequate support to make Green Revolution agricultural science work as it should. I would also note that Borlaug also contended equally as adamantly that population control was simply a very basic aspect of making Green Revolution agricultural science work. Without population control, he always believed that agricultural science at best would keep up with food needs globally and perhaps even fall behind.
Thanks.
That's great. That's great. And so let's open it up. I have a couple things to say before we do that. One is to note that these fine books are available for sale. And the link to the press book sale is in the chat. So, and also for the Q&A section, we have Claire Lewis Evans, who's the senior acquisitions editor for the Natural History and Environment and History of Science and Southern Studies at the University of Alabama Press. Claire had a previous role at the press as editor for digital and electronic publishing. She's an active member of the Association of University Presses and served as chair of the association's Copyright and Intellectual Property Committee for 2014 and 15. So she's got a lot of expertise in this area and has busy recruiting fine manuscripts for this series. I also see that we've been joined by Dan Waterman. We introduced some of the other press folks earlier. Dan is the editor-in-chief at the press, and so just want to acknowledge Dan being here as well. So I've thought of a few questions, but I think maybe we should just go right ahead and open it up. There are a couple good questions in the chat already, and one very specific one for about Borlaug. And you're going to have to help me, Doug, with this acronym.
About the International Rice Research Institute.
The International
Rice Research Institute in the Philippines.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
The
so talk about that at all. And
yeah, the question had to do with the significance of the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. Because I just mentioned Borlaug in relation to South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. The International Rice Research Institute developed just an explosively high-yielding rice variety in 1966. It was called IR8. It really increased productivity across Southeast Asia. And in the chapter that I deal with on Southeast Asia, I'm looking at the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and a couple of other countries. The problem with IR8 was that it was incredibly susceptible to disease and insects, but it did provide the germplasm that other scientists used, including Chinese agricultural scientists, to make further modifications and develop rice varieties that were highly productive, but at the same time had greater resistance to disease and pests. So it was the equivalent of the International Wheat and Maize Center in Mexico. But the scientists there were very active in developing rice varieties for East Asia and Southeast Asia. I think that's the substance of
Oh,
the
great.
question.
Yeah, great. And so we have a question for Amy here. What did you find most surprising about the protest movements? How was this similar to other protest movements at the time? And then the question about how well did the citizens understand the science
Right.
behind this kind of?
There were two things that were surprising. One was in 1978, there's a documentary where they're interviewing veterans, and this is when the concerns about potential harm from exposure to the chemicals is made public, right? And so you can look at newspaper coverage, and it goes from like no coverage of Agent Orange at all to something like 500 newspaper accounts by the end of the year. So then again, in 1981, there's a group of people trying to like investigate the health concerns being raised about the exposure to the chemicals, and they have a transcript of their dialogue, and they're completely focused on North Vietnamese women who may have been exposed to the chemicals, and they're oblivious to this idea that male sperm may have been compromised, and it is, the defects are happening because of male exposure to the chemicals and not female exposure. And that was like a eureka moment, like an epiphany. Is like, oh my gosh, their focus is so shaped by gender that they haven't even considered the idea that there's something going on with male reproductive health versus women, right? So that was like a big moment for me. And I think we still can see it, right? Like, I mean, it even lingers today in some respects because the veterans have not been very successful in getting healthcare coverage and compensation extended to their children, right? So this is still like a debated point, even with the development of epigenetics. And then the second thing that surprised me, and this is silly, but it was the reappearance of actors. Like I talk about the scientists like in chapter 2, and then the ag scientists reappear as a trip to Globe to like assess whether or not the herbicides are what are causing the local problems. And so it was like, I had not realized how really small of a group of individuals in some respects that I was looking at. Like, so people would reappear from like chapter 1 to chapter 9. And I was like, oh, they're back. They're here, like I'm thinking specifically of an ag scientist at University of Nebraska. And now I'm not gonna remember his name, but he was like a through line the whole way through. And then some of the scientists protesting reappear, and the activists themselves reappear in like newsletters and things like that. So I was surprised about the interconnected relationships that were present among both the activists and the people promoting the chemicals as well. And then with respect to understanding the science, it was really interesting. Many of the grassroots activists actually educated themselves, and because they had been so contested from its use in Vietnam, there was like a lot of information out. Like Thomas Whiteside, who was a reporter for the New Yorker, had an extensive series about the harm that was happening, actually produced a book. And so they, one group in particular went to the local library and were looking up the chemicals and the potential harm and things like that. So a lot of the activists actually took it very seriously and made a good faith effort to educate themselves and felt like they could speak. And I think the fact that there were scientists involved from the beginning made a difference as well, because they had allies and people who were prepared to help them navigate their challenges to like the chemical corporations in the US government, the Forest Service and such. So a lot of them did educate themselves, but they were also very fortunate that there were scientists who were equally concerned about the potential toxic effects.
That's great. That's great. And let's just kind of open it up now. We've got so many smart people in this room about these issues. And let's hear some more questions and comments. David, your name's been invoked a couple of times. Do you want to weigh in here and say anything about how your book connects with these ones we've heard about today?
Sure, Ellen. First, I just want to say congratulations to all the authors. As I said in the chat, I really had a hard time restraining myself from purchases, and part of that is the logistics of not having to carry the books back on the plane. But I just wanted to say first, thank you, each of you, for doing these works, for writing, for the work that you're published with this series and that you're sharing it in the world. And Amy, I'm just thinking about your book in particular. You know, one of the things that really stood out to me about Amy's work is that sort of the venues of protest, unexpected venues of protest, and technologies used for protest. That's another part of your work, Amy, that really stood out to me. I guess I would say more on a first-time author's basis, I thought that the press and the series in particular was a perfect fit for me. And anyone watching this later, you know, kind of thinking about this for your own work, I highly recommend the series, not just because I'm in it, but my experience was a really an exceptional one. How I was treated as a first-time author, how that whole process went from beginning to end was a really important one for me. And I felt like I was heard at every stage. So I wanted to express my thankfulness for that. But also, I think one of the values of this series is the extent to which all of these different threads do intersect in really revealing ways. And so each one of your works, I'm excited to read and assign for that very reason. I think students, not just scholars, can really benefit, you know, in their ability to track these intersections, how these things intersect, these different threads, and what is revealed anew when we pay attention to that. And so I guess my final point is that's the beauty of the series, is that the works are very accessible in that regard. It can be taught and brought into a variety of classroom scenarios that aren't just history, but very interdisciplinary and really provide kind of that grounding. So I'll stop talking now, but I just wanted to say thank you to each of the authors and thank you to the press. I'm excited to read this work.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And really good to offer congratulations to everyone. Doug, I had a question. Later in the book, you get more into the gene revolution. I wonder if you wanted to tell us a little more what you had to say about that.
Sure. The gene revolution in many respects is just a continuation of the green revolution science. Instead of developing high-yielding varieties in test fields, we're really talking about genetically modified plants in laboratories. And the problem has been that even though agricultural scientists have professed that there's no danger with genetically modified foods, there's been a perception among a number of publics across the world that there might be an inherent danger. And so that's prevented widespread adoption in some areas. But this is a messy and a complex subject because matters of nationalism and international trade agreements factor in. The Chinese have seen American genetically modified crops as being intrusions and denying them possibly their own food security because they purchased a lot of American soybeans and corn in the past. And that's become an issue. At the same time, the Chinese have very succinctly, quickly adapted to international trade policy in that a number of the sub-Saharan African nations have direct ties, close ties to European nations that simply prohibit the adoption or the sale, the use of genetically modified foods. And so they're not going to use these particular seed varieties if it's going to damage their trade. The Chinese have pivoted on this very quickly in that There are no human foods, genetically modified human foods that they place on the market. They do still purchase a lot of American soybeans and corn. That's virtually all genetically modified. But the catch is, it's not used for human food, but for livestock food. So the matter of health and trade and nationalism, it's really a complex issue that is not going to go away soon. But it's very much there. And you can't make people, you can say there's no evidence that GM foods are dangerous, and this other side of the coin is there's no evidence that they're not. And as
Yeah.
long as that's hanging out there, there's always going to be enough pushback or hesitance. So you're going to see this affecting trade and international relations on a number of levels.
Right, right. It's had enormous impact on the farming system, agricultural systems. Yeah. So we lost Mark Hersey, who's one of the series editors, to internet issues, but we still have, I believe, Alex Huey, who is here. And Alex, I wonder if you want to jump in and just say a little bit more about, the series, what kinds of issues you're working on related to this. Tell us.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Again, I want to thank the panelists for joining us, and everyone that gave comments, and everyone that's here to talk about this series. We're really excited to pull this together, and it in some ways came out of conversations between Mark and Alan and I over the years, and our own sort of interest. We kind of each represent a different node here, but our own work, I think, has converged around these intersections of environmental history and history of science and history of medicine, and it got us thinking how there's actually quite a bit of scholarship that's working at these point of intersections that is very good and is very interesting and should be showcased as working at these sort of points of contact. And so I think you can see from today's panel that the books that were discussed, that this is a really sort of rich vein to mine, for new narratives, as well as putting analytical modes in conversation. And so we're hoping that this is sort of expands all of these fields, or sort of creates this new place where they're in constant conversation, because it seems to raise a level of discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So Joel, we have a question for you in the chat. Have you been surprised by the impact of H. Wiener's work in cybernetics as a model systems outside of computer science and other sciences such as biology over the course of the 20th century? Again, we need to do the mute button.
Sorry about that.
That's all
Well,
right.
just from a personal point of view, I think my interest in ecosystem ecology in particular makes this not surprising at all, because so many of the ecosystem scientists were heavily influenced by cybernetics, and they were interested in computers and computer modeling, and so that was a close fit there. And the interactions between Wiener and Walter Cannon's laboratory. Wiener was at MIT and Cannon was at Harvard. There was a lot of interaction between those groups there. So it seems natural to me, although I can see why it might seem unusual to others.
Mm-hmm. I had a different sort of question for you, Joel, and that is this balance of nature notion. It has really been so influential in the campaigns, in the pressure for environmental protection. It's, we need to restore the balance of nature has been just a sort of overarching theme for environmentalists in lobbying and, public education about the environment. And you examined two pretty closely aligned ideas about that, but there are critics coming further away. Some people mentioned Cronin earlier. William Cronin talked about, there's no getting back to the real nature. And another way it's talked about is we're constantly dealing with changing baselines. So there's no restoring of a balance. And I'm curious what some of these, both the writers and the critics would argue about some of that.
Yeah. Well, I think I juxtapose a couple of pretty extreme positions, and personally, I think what's more interesting than that dichotomy is sort of the middle positions. I mean, if we think about homeostasis, for example, on an organismal level, we tend to think of cold-blooded animals and warm-blooded animals, and warm-blooded animals are homeostatic and cold-blooded aren't so much. But that ignores the fact that even in birds and mammals, there's lots of fluctuation in body temperature, especially with bats and hummingbirds and very small animals. They often let their temperature approximate the environmental temperature, and insects and lizards move in and out of sunlight to warm their bodies or cool them down. And so there isn't that sharp distinction. And in terms of ecology, I think what's particularly exciting today is all this work with the microbiome. And we have lots of evidence that the bacteria in our guts are helping maintain homeostasis. And so we have kind of a co-evolved system there. And I think that ecologists in general are kind of interested in that as an example of where you have a sort of a ecosystem level homeostasis, and they're extending it to other examples as well. So I don't know that that really answers your question, but I think that those are points of interest that are in the kind of the public conversation today.
Well, I mean, part of these debates in ecology are based on the fact that people are making these observations of the physical world and drawing their conclusions from that, and they just are making different observations. So other comments, questions?
Jerry Fitzgerald has another one in the.
Oh, yes, let's hear it. If you see it, read it, please.
So it's in the chat. Professor Hagen, have you been surprised by the impact of H. Wiener's work in cybernetics? Did you answer that?
Yeah, yeah, we did talk about that one. Yeah.
Could I ask a follow-up?
Absolutely, Fritz.
Joel, I thought one of the really nice connections you made between the way you problematize the microbiome, and particularly the gut microbiome, was the ways in which it kind of blurs the boundaries between the interior milieu and the exterior milieu. And I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's an interesting case when you think about it. That clearly we think of our gut as being inside us, but our gut is the external environment of all of the bacteria and fungi and viruses that are forming an ecosystem in that physical environment. And at the same time, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a lot of evidence that the interactions between us and bacteria living in us affects our homeostasis in terms of vitamin production and immune responses and all sorts of other examples that are probably pretty familiar to everyone that's followed the research in this area, even in the popular press.
Thank you.
So other questions, comments? Claire, would you like to say a little more about your hopes for the series going forward? And
Sure, I'll unmute myself. I just posted my question to the panel.
oh, okay. Well, yeah.
Topic, but I'd be happy to address publishing a little bit if we have any specific questions. I know we have many published authors here who are more or less familiar with the larger publishing process and happily working with the press. I can, of course, express our continuing interest in bringing more projects to us, or if you have students or recent doctoral, new PhDs that you've been working with, we'd be very happy to have conversations with them. And normally, of course, we would be in our booth at this and other conferences, eager to have one-on-one conversations, but we are present at our desk every day, and many of us are also available via social media if people want to reach out to us that way. So hopefully we're fairly easy to find and always easy to pick up the phone and reach us that way too, some old-fashioned technology. David's smiling, so I must have answered that all right. Nice to have someone on the camera.
Well, you also have a great question here in the chat.
Claire, I would actually say that it's a different kind of complacency that's led us to distrust in science, because we don't suffer the consequences of like epidemic disease in the way that previous generations did. I mean, really, when you think about the last, I would say, disease that Americans suffered collectively would be polio. And that's, several generations past in a very real sense. And I think one of the problems that we have, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is we had the development of 3 major vaccines in like basically less than a year, which is like an incredible testament to science. And that has been completely lost in the politicization of it, right? I mean, there's something kind of wrong with that reality. And I'm not sure how we fix it. Like, I know I look at a lot of people who are distrustful of science. And I think sometimes it's because they feel like it's not even the knowledge, but it's the ways that the knowledge gives, the perception that the knowledge gives these individuals authority over them in a way that they don't see as legitimate. And I think one of the challenges science has is to like treat protesters or activists as like partners in the endeavor and not quite be as dismissive of their concerns. I mean, I think, one of the repeating things that happens among the activists I look at is a lot of times they want a response. I mean, they're turning to an authority that they trust, and it's the dismissal of their concerns that like arouses the passion that leads them to take coffins to the Phoenix with all the dead plants. I mean, it's the fact that they are dismissed by scientists and dismissed by public officials that really arouses their passion. And there could have been a different outcome if they had been treated maybe slightly differently, is what I would, I think one thing for us to at least consider, not indulge the disbelief. But science is in a tricky position because we have used them to justify a lot of things. Maybe like the schools and like the police, they have been assigned a lot more societal responsibility than is fair for us to expect them to bear.
There's a real tension because we're asking people to rely more on climate science, for example, and at the same time, with science and technology studies for years has been talking about how scientists are just as situated as anyone else in terms of opinion and being right and wrong and all of that. So, other questions or comments? Well, we're coming up on our closing hour here. And so I just want to say again, go to the UA Press website and check out these books and others. Congratulations to these authors. We all have some idea, I think most everybody on here has some idea of how much work goes into these projects on the author side and on the editor side. And so they're all remarkable achievements. So thank you so much for sharing this time with us, to everyone.
And thanks to Claire for organizing.
Yes, echo that again. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's a terrific session.
Thanks.
Thank you all. And I will pitch that to simplify your book purchasing process, there is actually the sale goes on through the end of October, and you can use the conference code ASEHW 2021. So go to our website and use that, or write me and I will tell you what it is. But the book, all the NEXUS books are on sale, and many others in our list involving environmental history are on sale through the end of October. And we appreciate David buying some. Thanks, David.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now I get my credit card statement later, but it's all about the knowledge, folks.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming tonight. And I know it's been actually, thank you, David Spates, and everybody else at the Society for organizing Environmental History Week this week. I've been fascinated by the way that the entire non-conference has been kind of decentralized and open up to publics around the world. It's really a global event, and the calendar is full of fascinating sessions. I don't know how people could possibly keep up with all the great conversations that are going on. And, you know, I look forward to seeing how this continues in future months and years. So with that, I will let everybody wrap it up and have conversations with you elsewhere down the road. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.